What if the most dangerous decision in war is not disobedience, but blind obedience? In the chaos of combat, when orders are issued under pressure and time is measured in seconds, a single command can determine whether men live or die. This story begins at exactly that point, when a British squadron received an order that was clear, formal, and issued through the proper chain of command. An order that, on paper, made sense. An order that, if followed to the letter, would have led the entire squadron straight into annihilation. The setting was one of those moments the British military knew all too well. Stretched resources, incomplete intelligence, and an enemy that had adapted faster than expected. The squadron had been flying continuous operations, crews exhausted, aircraft already showing signs of wear. Fuel margins were tight. Ammunition loads were calculated for a specific type of engagement. And yet, headquarters believed they understood the situation well enough to dictate the next move from miles away, relying on maps, intercepted reports, and assumptions that no longer matched reality on the ground or in the air. The order itself was simple in structure but catastrophic in implication. Maintain course, hold formation, engage as planned. It reflected classic doctrine, the kind drilled into British pilots from the first days of training. Discipline saves lives. Coordination wins battles. Orders exist for a reason. In most cases, that logic was correct. But war has a way of punishing certainty, especially when conditions shift faster than command structures can react. What the men in the squadron were seeing did not align with what headquarters believed was happening. Weather patterns had changed visibility. Enemy positioning was not where intelligence reports said it would be. Radar coverage was incomplete, and recent encounters suggested the opposing force had adjusted its tactics specifically to exploit predictable British responses. From the cockpit, subtle details stood out. Radio silence where there should have been chatter. Movement patterns that hinted at an ambush rather than a routine interception. The uncomfortable sense that they were being guided into a kill zone designed in advance. British military culture placed enormous weight on obedience, particularly during this phase of the war. Ignoring a direct order was not a minor infraction. It could end careers, lead to courts-martial, or permanently stained reputations. Pilots were trained to trust the system, even when personal instincts screamed otherwise. The system, after all, was built on centuries of experience, but systems depend on information, and information in war is always incomplete. As the squadron pressed forward, the gap between what they were told and what they observed widened by the minute. Fuel consumption was higher than projected. Enemy aircraft were not appearing where expected, which in itself was alarming. Silence in war is often more dangerous than noise. Every mile flown while following the order increased the probability that turning back later would no longer be possible. Inside the lead aircraft, calculations were being made that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with survival. The numbers did not work. Time, fuel, distance, enemy capability, and escape options were being weighed against the consequences of disobedience. The order demanded trust in a plan that no longer existed. The reality demanded adaptation. This is the critical tension that defines the entire episode. Not bravery in the traditional sense, but judgment. Not heroics, but clarity under pressure. The squadron was not yet under fire, but the conditions for disaster were already locked into place. Following the order meant committing to a path with no margin for error. Ignoring it meant taking responsibility for every outcome that followed, good or bad. British doctrine taught that hesitation kills, but this was not hesitation. This was recognition. Recognition that war punishes rigidity more harshly than it punishes initiative. The men involved understood that once the enemy revealed itself, it would be too late to correct course. Decisions made now, before the first shots were fired, would decide everything. At this exact moment, with radios crackling and engines burning fuel they could not afford to waste, the squadron stood at a crossroads that history rarely records accurately. One path followed the written order and led directly into an enemy trap. The other path required ignoring that order entirely, trusting experience over instruction, observation over doctrine, and responsibility over obedience. And that is where this story truly begins. Because what happened next was not a lucky escape or a dramatic dogfight, but a quiet, calculated decision that would save every aircraft and every crew member involved. A decision that would later be questioned, softened in reports, and stripped of its full significance. A decision that proves one uncomfortable truth about military history. Sometimes survival depends on knowing exactly when not to follow orders. Before we continue, take a moment to think about what you just heard. This story is not only about a battle or a squadron, but about how understanding the reality of combat can be more important than simply following instructions written far from the front. If you want to truly grasp how decisions like this shape survival in war, leave a comment below and tell us what you think matters more in combat: strict obedience or situational judgment. Your perspective helps keep these discussions alive. If this kind of deep, story-driven military history is valuable to you, make sure to leave a like. It tells the platform that these hidden moments of strategy, tension, and human decision-making deserve to be shared. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the best moment to do it. Every subscription helps us bring more stories like this one to the surface. Stories that rarely make it into official histories, but change everything behind the scenes. The reason that order was so dangerous becomes clear only when the full context of the mission is understood. On the surface, it looked routine. Another sortie, another set of coordinates, another interception planned according to established British doctrine. But beneath that familiar structure, almost every variable that mattered had shifted in subtle but deadly ways. This was not a situation where courage or flying skill would decide the outcome. It was a scenario where physics, fuel, timing, and enemy anticipation were already stacked against the squadron before the first enemy aircraft ever appeared. The operational environment had deteriorated faster than command realized. Weather patterns in the region had changed visibility layers, compressing cloud cover at altitudes that British planners assumed would remain clear. That alone altered engagement geometry. Aircraft that expected long-range visual acquisition would instead be forced into close-range encounters with reduced reaction time. In air combat, difference is measured in seconds, and seconds decide survival. Fuel planning made the situation even worse. The order assumed a standard engagement window with enough reserve fuel to disengage, climb, and return under power. But recent headwinds had increased burn rates beyond projections. The squadron was already operating closer to its fuel limits than headquarters believed. Following the order meant pushing deeper into hostile airspace with shrinking margins and fewer escape options. Any deviation later would not be tactical. It would be desperate. Enemy behavior added another layer of risk. Over the previous weeks, opposing forces had demonstrated a clear pattern. They had learned British habits. They knew how British squadrons approached, how long they stayed on course, when they committed, and when they turned back. Predictability had become a liability. The enemy was no longer reacting. They were setting traps, using silence and delayed engagement to draw squadrons into positions where retreat was impossible without heavy losses. Radar and intelligence failures compounded the danger. Ground controllers were working with delayed or incomplete data, relying on assumptions that had been accurate weeks earlier but were now dangerously outdated. The order to maintain course was based on the belief that enemy aircraft would engage from expected vectors. In reality, those vectors were empty, not because the enemy was absent, but because they were waiting somewhere else entirely. From the cockpit, the picture looked wrong. Too quiet, too empty, too perfect. Experienced pilots understand that when nothing matches expectations, it usually means someone else is controlling the situation. The absence of enemy contacts was not reassuring. It was ominous. Silence suggested coordination. Coordination suggested intent. If the squadron had followed the order exactly as given, they would have crossed a point of no return, a zone where turning back would expose them during fuel-critical phases, a zone where enemy aircraft could engage with altitude, position, and numerical advantage. The order did not account for this because the data feeding it did not reflect the present reality of the airspace. British doctrine emphasized formation, integrity, and commitment. Breaking formation early was considered dangerous. Turning away without contact was viewed as hesitation or even cowardice. But doctrine assumes symmetry, that both sides are operating under similar constraints. Here, that assumption was false. The enemy had freedom of movement, fresh aircraft, and the element of surprise. The British squadron had limited fuel, fatigue, and rigid instructions. This is what made the mission nearly suicidal, not because the pilots lacked skill, but because the structure guiding them was no longer aligned with reality. Every mile flown under the order increased exposure. Every minute reduced flexibility. The squadron was being pulled forward by momentum rather than logic. What is rarely acknowledged in official histories is how often annihilation comes not from enemy fire, but from unchallenged assumptions. The order was not reckless by intent. It was reckless by context. It belonged to a battlefield that no longer existed, and yet, despite all of this, the order remained active. The radios stayed quiet. The formation held. Engines burned fuel. The trap was closing, not through dramatic movement, but through inertia. At this stage, no one was shooting. No alarms were sounding. And that was precisely the problem, because when the shooting finally started, there would be no room left to think. The difference between destruction and survival often comes down to one person noticing what everyone else overlooks. In this case, it was not a dramatic act of defiance or a loud confrontation over the radio. It was a quiet realization forming inside the mind of a single British officer who had seen enough combat to recognize patterns when they broke. He was not the most senior man in the formation, nor the most decorated, but he had something more valuable in that moment: perspective shaped by experience rather than doctrine alone. From his position, he began mentally reconstructing the situation as it truly was, not as it had been briefed hours earlier. He compared fuel consumption against distance, time against weather drift, enemy silence against recent tactical trends. Individually, none of these factors guaranteed disaster. Together, they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. This was not an interception waiting to happen. It was an ambush waiting to close. British training emphasized trust in centralized command for good reason. Air operations required coordination on a scale no individual pilot could manage alone. But that same system created a vulnerability when information lagged behind reality. The officer understood that headquarters was making decisions based on a version of the battlefield that no longer existed. Maps were clean. The sky ahead was not. What made his realization so dangerous was that it challenged a deeply ingrained assumption that higher command always had a clearer view. In many cases, that was true. But in this case, the clearest view belonged to the men already in the air, watching conditions change in real time. The officer recognized that the squadron was being guided by certainty rather than evidence. He began asking questions that were never written into checklists. Why would the enemy leave this corridor empty if intelligence said they were nearby? Why had previous engagements ended with delayed contact rather than immediate interception? Why did fuel margins feel tighter than projected, despite flying at standard cruise settings? These were not theoretical concerns. They were practical warnings. The most unsettling realization came when he considered enemy intent. The opposing force had studied British behavior long enough to know that orders were followed meticulously. Predictability was their advantage. If the squadron continued forward, the enemy would not need to rush. They could wait, let fuel drain, let options disappear, and strike when retreat became impossible. At this point, the officer understood something critical. Once the trap was visible to everyone, it would already be too late. Waiting for confirmation meant accepting the conditions the enemy had designed. The only window to act was before the first contact, before the situation escalated into chaos, where initiative vanished. This was not a moment of panic. It was a moment of clarity. The officer weighed consequences with brutal honesty. Disobeying the order could end his career. It could result in formal reprimand or worse. If his judgment was wrong, he would be responsible for confusion, fragmentation, and possibly disaster. But if he was right, obedience would lead to the destruction of the entire squadron. Military history often celebrates courage under fire, but far less attention is given to courage before fire begins. The courage to act when there is still time to choose, and no certainty to justify that choice. The officer understood that doctrine could not save them here. Only adaptation could. He also understood that hesitation would decide the outcome by default. Every second spent bathing internally was a second closer to commitment. War does not punish indecision gently. It punishes it absolutely. The realization was complete now. The order was wrong, not because it violated rules, but because it violated reality. The battlefield had shifted, and the order had not. If the squadron survived, it would not be because they followed instructions perfectly, but because someone recognized when those instructions no longer applied. The decision still had not been made. The formation was intact. The radios were quiet, but the moment of understanding had already changed everything. From here on, doing nothing was itself a choice, and a fatal one. The moment when disobedience becomes the only rational option rarely announces itself with drama. There was no shouted argument over the radio, no emotional declaration, no cinematic pause. Instead, it arrived quietly, wrapped in calculations, instinct, and the growing certainty that continuing forward meant surrendering control to an enemy who had already planned the next move. Inside the lead aircraft, the officer replayed the order one final time in his mind. Maintain course. Hold formation. Engage as planned. Each instruction assumed conditions that no longer existed. Following it now would not demonstrate discipline or professionalism. It would demonstrate blindness. And blindness in combat is lethal. What made this instant so difficult was not fear of the enemy, but fear of responsibility. Ignoring a British order was not just a tactical decision. It was a personal one. It meant accepting full ownership of whatever followed. Survival or destruction would no longer belong to headquarters, doctrine, or written procedure. It would belong to the man who chose to act. The squadron was still intact, engine steady, altitude stable, no enemy contacts on visual or radio confirmation. That calm was deceptive. Calm, in this case, was the last phase before commitment. Once the enemy revealed itself, maneuver options would collapse instantly. Fuel states would dictate movement. Surprise would belong to the opponent. This was the narrow window where a decision still mattered. The officer understood something few people outside combat grasp intuitively. Orders are tools, not laws of physics. They are meant to guide action, not replace judgment. When the environment changes faster than the order cycle can respond, clinging to instructions becomes a liability. The enemy was counting on that rigidity. They were exploiting it. Breaking formation later, under fire, would scatter the squadron to vulnerable, isolated targets. Turning back now, before contact, preserved cohesion. It preserved fuel. It preserved initiative, but it also meant openly contradicting command intent. There was no perfect solution, only a least disastrous one. The internal calculation was ruthless. If the order was followed and the squadron was destroyed, responsibility would be diffuse. Reports would cite overwhelming enemy strength, unavoidable circumstances, brave men lost in action. If the order was ignored and something went wrong, responsibility would be singular, names would be written, careers would end. The military system prefers predictable failure to unpredictable initiative. But survival does not operate on bureaucratic logic. The officer keyed his radio briefly, not to announce disobedience, but to test responsiveness. Silence confirmed what he already suspected. Ground controllers were not seeing what the squadron was seeing. The information gap was real, and it was widening. This was the final confirmation he needed. Waiting for updated instructions was no longer an option. By the time new orders arrived, if they arrived at all, the opportunity to act would be gone. He issued a short, controlled command to the formation. No explanation, no debate. A change in heading, a subtle shift in altitude. Movements that, to an outside observer, might have looked like minor adjustments. In reality, they represented a complete rejection of the original order's intent. The squadron responded instantly, not because they understood every reason behind the decision, but because they trusted the man giving it. Trust in combat is built long before moments like this. It is earned in consistency, competence, and calm under pressure. When the formation adjusted, there was no confusion, no hesitation. The machinery of survival began to move. This not retreat. It was repositioning, not avoidance, but denial. Denial of the conditions the enemy required to execute their plan. At that instant, the order from headquarters became irrelevant. The battlefield had shifted to a scale where centralized control could not compete with immediate perception. The officer had crossed an invisible line. From this point forward, outcomes would be judged not by compliance, but by results. What followed would prove whether this decision was brilliance or catastrophic arrogance. The enemy had not yet revealed itself, but the trap was already failing. The carefully prepared scenario was unraveling, not because of superior firepower, but because someone refused to behave exactly as expected. The effect of that single deviation was immediate, even though no shots had been fired yet. The enemy plan, built on anticipation and timing, began to unravel the moment the squadron stopped behaving predictably. What had been designed as a clean, decisive engagement suddenly lost its shape. Traps only work when the target moves exactly where it is expected to move. The British squadron no longer did. Enemy forces had positioned themselves to exploit commitment. They were counting on the squadron to cross a specific airspace corridor at a specific altitude, with fuel states already trending toward limitation. From there, the plan was simple: force engagement, deny, escape, and let physics do the rest. But the moment the formation altered heading, an altitude earlier than Doctrine dictated, the geometry collapsed. This is where the brilliance of the maneuver becomes visible. The squadron did not flee blindly or scatter. It repositioned just far enough to invalidate the enemy's assumptions while preserving cohesion. By changing altitude, they altered sight lines. By shifting course, they disrupted intercepting. What had been a guaranteed interception window became a rapidly shrinking opportunity. The enemy was not prepared to adjust to inhale time. Enemy aircraft began to appear, but not in the way intelligence had predicted. Instead of emerging in a coordinated wave from optimal angles, they surfaced piecemeal, uncertain, forced to react rather than execute. Pilots who had been waiting patiently for the perfect moment suddenly faced a moving problem. Reaction replaced preparation, and reaction in air combat is always inferior. The British pilots could feel the shift even before fully understanding it. Haju shutter picked up. Visual contacts appeared at awkward angles. The enemy was there, but out of position. That alone confirmed the officer's assessment had been correct. They had not avoided the enemy. They had disrupted him. The key detail often missed in simplified retellings is that the squadron did not gain an advantage through aggression, but through denial. They denied the enemy the engagement he wanted. In doing so, they forced him into a dilemma: commit under suboptimal conditions or disengage, and risk losing the opportunity entirely. Enemy pilots chose to commit, but now the initiative had shifted. Instead of attacking a formation low on fuel and locked into a predictable path, they faced a squadron with maneuver in space, energy, flexibility, and awareness. What should have been a decisive strike became a series of fragmented encounters. At this stage, the engagement was no longer about numbers or firepower. It was about tempo. The British squadron controlled it. They chose when to engage and when to disengage, bleeding time from the enemy's plan. Each minute that passed reduced the enemy's window and increased British options. This was the silent victory most reports failed to capture. No dramatic dogfight was required to break the enemy's plan. No heroic last stand, just a refusal to enter the battlefield on the enemy's terms. The opposing force had invested resources, fuel, and coordination into a scenario that no longer existed. As the situation evolved, enemy pilots found themselves making riskier moves, pressing attacks without the support or positioning they had expected. Those risks led to mistakes. Mistakes led to missed shots, aborted runs, and growing uncertainty. Confidence, once absolute, began to fracture. From the British perspective, the danger had not vanished, but it had transformed. Instead of a guaranteed annihilation, they now faced a manageable engagement with options. Options mean survival, options mean choice, and choice is the one thing the original order would have taken away completely. What happened next would determine how far this advantage could be exploited and whether The decision to ignore the order would be remembered as foresight or insubordination. The enemy was adapting quickly. This was not over, but the balance had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The squadron was no longer flying into a trap. They were forcing the enemy to improvise. And in war, the side forced to improvise under pressure is usually the side that loses. What followed was not a dramatic explosion of firepower, but something far more decisive. Time began working against the enemy instead of the squadron. The decision to ignore the order did more than disrupt a single interception. It triggered a chain reaction that reshaped the entire engagement in ways no one on the ground could have anticipated in advance. The first effect was operational. Fuel, which had been the squadron's greatest vulnerability, suddenly became an asset. By denying the enemy a clean engagement window, the British pilots avoided the high-burn phases that would have locked them into a fight they could not sustain. Every minute spent maneuvering on their own terms preserved options. Meanwhile, enemy aircraft that had been waiting in holding patterns were now forced to chase, burning fuel rapidly and losing their positional advantage. The second effect was tactical. Enemy coordination depended on timing and geometry. Once that geometry collapsed, coordination degraded fast. Pilots began making individual decisions instead of acting as a unified force. Some pressed attacks prematurely. Others hesitated, unsure if the conditions still favored them. That hesitation fractured their approach and diluted what should have been overwhelming pressure. The third effect was psychological, and it may have been the most important. The enemy had expected compliance. They had planned for obedience. When the squadron refused to behave as anticipated, it introduced doubt. Doubt spreads quickly in combat. Pilots who believed they were stepping into a controlled kill zone suddenly realized they were flying blind. Situational awareness eroded, and with it, confidence. From inside the British formation, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The tension did not disappear, but it changed character. Instead of the tightening anxiety of inevitability, there was now alert focus. Pilots were no longer waiting to be attacked. They were observing, adjusting, and reacting with purpose. That mental transition matters. A force that believes it has options behaves differently than one that believes its fate is sealed. The domino effect extended beyond the immediate airspace. Enemy controllers, tracking the engagement, were forced to revise assumptions. Resources allocated for a decisive strike were now being spent simply trying to re-establish contact. That delay mattered. Delays in war are rarely neutral. They favor the side that has already broken the enemy's plan. Crucially, the squadron's survival did not hinge on winning a spectacular fight. It hinged on avoiding a catastrophic one. By refusing to commit under the wrong conditions, they preserved the integrity of the formation. Every aircraft that stayed intact multiplied the squadron's defensive strength. Every pilot who remained focused increased collective resilience. This is why the decision saved more than immediate lives. It preserved combat power. A destroyed squadron is gone forever. A surviving squadron can fight again tomorrow. That distinction shapes campaigns, not just battles. What is often misunderstood is that turning away early is not weakness. It is selection. Selection of favorable conditions over unfavorable ones. The enemy wanted a decisive engagement on his terms. He did not get it. Instead, he faced an adversary that dictated tempo and denied closure. By the time the engagement wound down, the enemy's opportunity had evaporated. Fuel states, timing and uncertainty forced disengagement. The moment for annihilation passed quietly, without fanfare, without heroic last stands. It simply never happened. From a distance, it might have looked like nothing remarkable occurred. No más losses, no dramatic victory claims. And yet, this was the precise point at which the squadron's fate was sealed in its favor. Survival had been chosen over spectacle. What remained was the aftermath, and the aftermath would be just as dangerous in a different way, because now the enemy was frustrated, and command would soon realize that an order had been ignored. How that realization unfolded would determine whether the truth of what happened would be acknowledged or buried. The danger did not end when the enemy disengaged. In many ways, it only changed form. What the squadron faced next was not hostile aircraft, but the weight of a military system built on hierarchy, discipline, and the expectation of compliance. The immediate threat had passed, but the consequences of ignoring a direct British order were only beginning to surface. When the squadron returned, reports began flowing upward through command channels. Timelines did not match projections. Engagement zones differed from what had been authorized. Fuel states were lower than expected, yet losses were zero. From a purely operational standpoint, the outcome was flawless. From an administrative standpoint, it was suspicious. British command culture valued results, but it valued order even more. An unexpected success was acceptable. An unexplained deviation was not. Somewhere between squadron debriefs and higher-level summaries, a realization formed: the mission had not unfolded according to plan because the plan had not been followed. The reaction was not immediate outrage. It was confusion. Analysts tried to reconcile maps with pilot accounts. Controllers compared radar logs with flight paths. The more they examined the data, the clearer it became that the squadron had made a conscious choice to deviate early, before enemy contact, without explicit authorization. That realization created an uncomfortable dilemma for command. Punishing the decision would reinforce discipline, but force leadership to explain why strict obedience would have resulted in total loss. Praising the decision would validate initiative, but undermine the very structure that allowed large-scale operations to function. As a result, the response became cautious and indirect. Questions were asked without accusation. Language was softened. Phrases like situational adjustment and operational discretion appeared where the word disobedience should have been. The system searched for a way to absorb what had happened without acknowledging the precedent it set. Inside the squadron, the mood was tense but restrained. The pilots understood exactly how close they had come to disaster, and they understood the risk their officer had taken on their behalf. There was no celebration, no bravado. Survival brought relief, not triumph. Everyone knew that if the decision had been wrong, they would not be there to defend it. What made this episode particularly unsettling for command was that there was no clear counter-argument. The data supported the outcome. Enemy intent had been confirmed later through intelligence intercepts. The engagement corridor had indeed been a trap. The order, while logical at the time it was issued, had been based on outdated assumptions. Admitting that openly would mean acknowledging a structural weakness, that real-time judgment at the tactical level could sometimes outperform centralized planning. That idea challenged deeply held beliefs about control, predictability, and authority. So, the truth was that the reports focused on enemy miscalculation rather than British adaptation. Success was attributed to favorable conditions instead of decisive judgment. The ignored order became an uncomfortable footnote rather than the central fact. This reaction reveals something critical about military institutions. They evolve slowly, not because leaders are blind, but because change threatens stability. A system designed to function at scale resists lessons that empower individuals too much, even when those lessons save lives. Yet within the squadron, the lesson was clear and irreversible. They had seen what blind obedience could have cost them, and they had seen what conscious judgment had preserved. That knowledge would not disappear simply because reports avoided mentioning it. The irony is that the command structure survived precisely because someone temporarily stepped outside it. The system was protected by an act it could not comfortably acknowledge, and that unresolved tension between obedience and judgment would continue to shape decisions long after this mission faded from official memory. What happened next was not an investigation in the traditional sense, but a quiet reshaping of the narrative. Official records began to circulate, and with each layer of documentation, the reality of what had occurred became more abstract. Times were rounded. Language was neutralized. Cause and effect were blurred just enough to make the episode appear routine rather than exceptional. In the official version, the squadron had demonstrated sound judgment under evolving operational conditions. The wording mattered. It removed the central conflict entirely. There was no mention of an ignored order, no acknowledgement that obedience would have led to annihilation. Instead, the event was reframed as a natural adjustment within acceptable parameters, a deviation without defiance, a success without risk. This kind of documentation is not accidental. Military reports are designed to preserve continuity and confidence, not to expose moments where the system nearly failed. Admitting that a direct order was fundamentally wrong would raise uncomfortable questions. Who issued it? Why was the intelligence flawed? How many other squadrons might have been placed in similar danger without realizing it? So the uncomfortable parts were softened. The responsibility was dispersed. The lesson was that pilots' first-hand accounts, when they conflicted with official timelines, were edited for clarity. Not falsified, but compressed. Words like concern, unease, and unexpected conditions replaced phrases that hinted at imminent disaster. The emotional reality of the moment disappeared entirely. Fear, doubt, and the weight of the decision had no place in the final report. This is how history often loses its most valuable insights. Not through lies, but through omission. What was left out mattered more than what was included. The fact that the enemy had anticipated British behavior, the fact that predictability had nearly destroyed an entire unit, the fact that survival depended on rejecting the assumptions built into the order itself. None of that translated cleanly into doctrine, so none of it survived intact in the records. Instead, the episode became just another successful sortie in a long list of operations. No commendations for initiative, no formal acknowledgement of risk, no institutional lesson drawn publicly from the near catastrophe that had been avoided. Yet beneath the surface, something subtle shifted. Squadron-level briefings began to emphasize observation over assumption. Pilots were encouraged, quietly, to trust what they saw as much as what they were told. Not officially, not in writing, but in tone, in phrasing, in what experienced officers emphasized when younger pilots asked questions. This informal transmission of knowledge is how militaries truly adapt, not through sweeping policy changes, but through whispered corrections and shared understanding among those who have survived the consequences of rigidity. The irony is that the system protected itself by pretending nothing extraordinary had happened, while the people within it absorbed the lesson fully. The order was ignored once, but its implications lingered far longer than the paperwork suggested. The lesson left behind by this episode was never written as a rule, never formalized as doctrine, and never taught explicitly in training manuals. Yet it spread anyway, carried quietly by those who understood what had almost happened. It was a lesson that made many commanders uncomfortable because it challenged one of the military's most sacred assumptions, that obedience is always safer than judgment. The reality exposed by this incident was far more unsettling. Obedience works only when the information behind an order is accurate and current. When that information lags behind reality, obedience becomes a liability. The squadron survived not because they followed procedure perfectly, but because someone recognized that procedure had fallen out of sync with the battlefield. This is rarely taught because it cannot be standardized. Judgment cannot be issued as an order. It cannot be reduced to checklists or flow. It depends on experience, awareness, and the willingness to accept responsibility when the cost of being wrong is personal and immediate. That makes institutions uneasy. Systems prefer predictability, even when predictability leads to disaster. In many military histories, disobedience is framed as reckless or insubordinate unless it produces a dramatic victory. Quiet survival does not fit the narrative. There was no enemy squadron wiped out, no heroic last stand, no obvious triumph to justify breaking the rules. And yet the absence of loss was the achievement. The squadron lived because someone chose to think rather than comply. The unspoken takeaway was not ignore orders, but something far more nuanced and dangerous. Understand why an order exists, and recognize when the conditions that justified it no longer apply. That distinction matters. Blind obedience treats orders as immutable truths. Intelligent obedience treats them as tools that must be evaluated against reality. Veteran pilots absorbed this instinctively. They began paying closer attention to silence, two patterns that did not align with briefings, two subtle changes that suggested enemy intent. They learned that when everything appears calm but feels wrong, it usually is, and that waiting for confirmation can be the deadliest choice of all. This lesson traveled informally, passed from office to officer, pilot to pilot, not as rebellion, but as caution. Trust the system, but do not surrender your perception to it. Use doctrine, but do not become trapped by it. Above all, remember that survival often depends on decisions made before the first shot is fired. The danger of this lesson is precisely why it remains unofficial. If misunderstood, it could justify chaos. But when understood correctly, it becomes a safeguard against catastrophic rigidity. The difference lies in maturity, experience, and restraint. This is why the episode never became a celebrated case study. It did not fit comfortably into existing frameworks. It did not produce a clean moral. It produced an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most disciplined act in war is knowing when discipline must bend, and that truth would resurface again and again in later conflicts, often without anyone remembering where it had first been learned. What ultimately made this episode significant was not the immediate survival of the squadron, but the way it quietly altered how decisions were made long after the mission ended. The ignored order did not become a rule, but it became a reference point, a mental checkpoint, a reminder that warfare evolves faster than paperwork, and that survival often depends on recognizing that gap before it becomes fatal. In the months that followed, similar situations unfolded across different theaters. Orders issued with confidence met realities that had shifted overnight. Enemy tactics adapted, weather disrupted assumptions. Fuel calculations failed under unexpected conditions. And in those moments, officers who had lived through near disasters like this one made different choices. They hesitated less. They questioned more. Not openly, not defiantly, but internally, with sharper awareness. The legacy of this decision was subtle. It did not rewrite doctrine overnight, but it influenced how doctrine was interpreted in practice. Commanders became more attentive to reports from the air rather than relying solely on projections from the ground. Pilots learned to read silence as information. Squadrons learned that survival was not always about pressing forward, but about choosing the right moment to deny engagement altogether. Enemy forces, too, felt the effects without fully understanding them. Predictability traps that once worked reliably began failing. Interceptions became less decisive. What had once been a controlled hunt turned into a series of uncertain encounters. The psychological balance shifted, not because of superior weapons, but because expectation had been broken. This is how real change happens in war. Not through grand announcements, but through accumulated hesitation on the enemy's side and accumulated confidence on one's own. Confidence, not in invincibility, but in judgment. What makes this story uncomfortable is that it does not celebrate defiance for its own sake. It exposes a more difficult truth. Systems designed to manage war at scale are necessary, but they are never perfect. They rely on assumptions that will eventually fail. When they do, the cost is paid by the people closest to the consequences. The squadron survived because someone recognized that reality had diverged from instruction. That recognition did not come from rebellion, but from responsibility. From understanding that following an order is meaningless if the outcome is destruction. The real legacy of this ignored order is not found in official records, but in the quiet moments when officers chose to trust what they saw rather than what they were told. When they adjusted before contact, when they preserved lives without ever claiming victory. This is why such stories rarely appear in simplified histories. They offer no clean heroism, no dramatic finales, no satisfying conclusions. Only survival, achieved through restraint, awareness, and the courage to accept accountability. And that uncomfortable lesson continues to echo. Whatever orders meets reality under pressure. If you stayed until this point, you understand something most people never do about war. Survival is not always decided by firepower or courage, but by judgment made before the first shot is fired. If this story changed the way you think about obedience, command, and decision-making under pressure, let us know you made it to the end by leaving a comment with the phrase, "Judgment saves lives." That comment matters more than you think. If this video gave you value, take a second to leave a like. It helps push stories like this to people who want more than simplified history. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. This channel exists to uncover the moments that official records soften, ignore, or quietly erase. One more thing before you go. The next video appearing on your screen explores another moment where a single unexpected decision changed the outcome of an entire battle. Click it now while this story is still fresh. That's via da, where this pattern continues.